Good morning, everyone. Welcome to a new week. This week I want to talk about the Imperium Keyplates of the British Commonwealth. So these are the designs that were in use. They first started in the Queen Victoria period at the very end in the 1890s, and they persisted all the way up into the Elizabethan period with the Leeward Islands set that had Queen Elizabeth. So the design basically consisted of a large medallion, kind of almost an octagonal shape, but sort of a rounded octagon with the monarch's portrait, surrounded by some small dot and foliate ornaments, and then contained within vertical panels that read postage and revenue, some flourishes at the bottom panel that surround a diamond or sort of a rhombic oblong diamond shaped value tablet. And then at the top there would be a panel for the colony name and a crown right in the center that was framed by, or where the frame lines flank the crown. That's the Imperium Keyplate design. Now, there were other keyplates that were issued in some colonies for specific issues, but those are not the Imperium designs. A number of colonies utilized this design, and it was issued in two watermarks, at least for the George V period. The first designs were on multiple crown CA watermark, which was the block crown and block CA letters. And then in the early 20s, it was switched to script CA, which persisted through the George V and Elizabethan eras. Now, Gibbons does a fairly good job, as I said in one of my earlier videos, of listing out some varieties on this set. They're far more superficial in their treatment of it when they get to the script CA watermark. But in any event, Gibbons is far more extensive than Scott, which really doesn't list anything except the watermark differences and the dyes. So the first thing I want to talk about are the dye types. There are two main dyes. And on Ceylon, there is a third type of stamp which combines the characteristic of the two dyes on single working plates. And as far as I can remember, that's the only colony on which this occurs. So I'm just going to turn the camera around and show you the two dye types side by side. I think maybe take it off the tripod, actually. Just there we go. So on the left we have dye 1, and on the right we have dye 2, okay, for the straight settlements. So what I'm going to do is just quickly show you the different characteristics, and I'll do that by moving the images. So I'm going to look at dye 1 first. So there are 3 points to examine on each of the stamps in examining the dyes. So the first place we look at is where the lines flanking the crown are, here. Now on dye 1, you'll see that the lines follow the shape of the crown. They're truncated here, and they follow the shape of the crown. On dye 2, they're cut straight, and you'll see that in just a sec. So that's the first part. There's lines following the crown here, and on dye 2, if we move over, you can see they're straight. These bottom two. The top frame line here is cut to the crown, but the bottom two are straight up and down. Okay, the second place to look is the shape of the postage panel at the top here at the corner. So on die 1, the postage panel has a square corner. Okay, it's 90-degree angle. On die 2, that corner is going to be rounded, and you can see it's rounded here. It curves up and meets at a point. And that's a very easy thing to see. Now the third thing, and this is a characteristic I don't really ever really have to use much because I can usually see the other two areas very clearly, but there will be certain used stamps where you've got the cancel covering those parts of the design and you need a third characteristic. So here, it's the flourish on the bottom. If you look at this tail here, this flourish here, you'll see right here where this curves down before it meets this curly Q here, there's a nodule protruding out. Okay, on die 2, that nodule's missing. And you can see there's the curly Q, it's nice, it's smooth, no nodule here. Now, on Ceylon, there were some printings made of values from single working plates where they had the line crown characteristics of die 1 here, but they had the panel curve with the point of die 2. And that's, so they were kind of a hybrid of both. And that's unique, as far as I remember, unique to Ceylon. So I'm just going to turn the camera back and talk about some of the other aspects of this issue. So one aspect besides the dies that's very, very interesting for these issues are the shades and the colored papers. So in terms of shades, Gibbons lists a few. I mean, there's obvious differences in the overall appearance of the color on the stamps, but the other thing that sometimes occurs, and Gibbons does not do a good job of recognizing or listing this, is that there are some print stamps where the color of the value tablet and the color of the country inscription is slightly different from the color on the rest of the stamp. It's quite obvious in a lot of cases, and so Gibbons really should be listing both colors for the head plate and the duty plate color. But for some reason they've missed it. You see it a lot on the shilling gray blacks where you've got gray black for the head plate for the major part of the design, but then the actual country name and value tablet is a jet black, and they cannot both be the same ink. I've seen it on. I just worked on for Nigeria the 1 penny Carmen, where the main stamp is Carmen red, but the country name for Nigeria is dark carmine, which indicates that those were printed using 2 passes through the press, as opposed to some of the other colors where there's a single pass or a single operation. So that's an unstudied aspect to these issues. At least it would appear to be unstudied based on the fact that I don't see any catalog listings differentiating these differences. One comment I need to make about the colors concerns the 1 penny stamps, where you see on almost every colony, you see a carmine stamp first and then a scarlet version of that shade. That occurs most of the places, and with the carmine being the earlier color and then scarlet appearing during World War I. And the reason, of course, is because the dyes for carmine all came from Germany, And when those ink supplies were interrupted, they had to choose different inks, and that resulted in the scarlet colors that are listed in most catalogs. I mean, there were other substitutions made as well. And some of those are listed in Gibbons, like I say, and some of them are not. So there's, I would say, both the Crown CA and Script CA watermarks show a very wide range of shades. Another thing is that several of the low values, usually the half penny, 1 penny, and maybe up to the 2 pence of most values, were issued in booklets. And there's no listings in the catalog for booklet stamps. They are far, far, far less common than their sheet counterparts because in most cases, from what I can see, in my study of Nigerian stamps, the quantity of booklets produced was somewhere in the region of about 5 to 10% of the total printing. And a lot of those stamps will not have survived. Now, the way to identify them is to look at the perforations on one or two sides. And what you'll see is rather than being torn to separate them, they will be guillotined. And that's very easy to spot because on a normal perforated stamp, I'll just turn the camera around again and use the examples I just showed you. On a normal perforated stamp, if you look at the perfs, you can see that they're not perfectly uniform in length. There are slight differences in shape and in length. And you can see hairs, little microfibers protruding from the perf tips where they were separated and torn apart from their counterparts. On a guillotined perf, everything is perfectly uniform. There are no fibers protruding out. They have been cut. And the way the booklets were produced in those days is that sheets of stamps produced to make booklet panes were basically assembled together. Cover stock was put on either side of it, stapling was done, and then a guillotine was employed to cut the completed booklets apart. This resulted in perforations that are quite often very mutilated, depending on how well positioned the guillotine was. It was supposed to cut the stamps exactly halfway in between, and sometimes you do get stamps with full perforations on the outer edges that are nicely guillotined, but a lot of times the guillotine wasn't perfectly positioned, and it has either greatly shortened the perfs, or in some cases it results in a cut edge, a straight edge on one or two sides, depending on where on the pane the stamps come from. Now, the booklets in those days were also produced to open on either the right side or the left side. So your straight edges can be on any side of the stamp. It's not necessarily going to be on the right or the top and the bottom. You can have left hand edges that are straight, and they're still from booklets. So be on the lookout for those, because those are definitely scarcer than their sheet stamp counterparts. Okay, colored papers. So there's another interesting aspect to this issue. So values up to the 2 pence typically were on white paper, but starting with the 3 pence and the rupee equivalent, we start getting stamps on colored paper, like this 3 penny pair, which is on a yellow paper. Now, the early papers had a white back, like this, no color. The very first ones. Then during the war, they went to a yellow or a lemon color that's all the way through. So that's lemon. And some of them were deep yellow. So Gibbons does a fairly good job of distinguishing between the different colors. In addition to lemon, there's pale yellow, orange buff, and so on. So typically the colors are initially pre-war or very early wartime, wartime shades, and then later post-war colors. So on the yellow papers, they are white back, yellow or deep yellow, lemon, orange buff, and pale yellow. Orange buff and pale yellow being the later papers from 1920 and 21. Lemon is typically during the war, so 1915, 1916. Deep yellow and white backs are 1914 to 15. There's also a green paper that's used on some values, like here, the 1 shilling. This one's on what they call emerald paper. And a lot of care has to be taken here with the names that Gibbons uses, because they're not really in accordance with what you would normally think of for these colors. So for instance, Gibbons typically lists green, emerald, and emerald with pale olive back. This color I'm showing you here is really kind of a bluish green. And that's green with the white back. Emerald this is what they call emerald. But to me, it's really just green. It doesn't look particularly to me like emerald green. But it's definitely greener than the blue-green that they call green. There's also a yellow-green, which is quite rarely encountered. And it's just a brighter version of the green, as far as I'm concerned. Now, the pale olive back, that can be a little bit tricky, because again, it's not really an olive green or an olive. It's more like a skin tone when they talk about people having olive skin. That's really what it is. And it's just not white. So what you need in order to identify pale olive back correctly is you need to have some white backs that you know are white backs to compare. Because here, okay, the stamp on the right is white back. The stamp on the left is pale olive. And you can see it's not a very big difference, but you can see a slight tinge on the pale olive back, a slight greenish tint. And that's really all it is. There is a deep yellow shade on the paper as well. That's a thick paper, very thick. And it's quite markedly thicker than the regular paper, so that's a fairly easy one to identify. And again, it's usually a good stamp. Then there's a blue paper. And the blue paper is really, Gibbons doesn't really list any differences in the blue paper, even though there are differences to be found. So this is the standard blue paper. If you turn it over, it's kind of a gray blue, in my opinion. But that's the standard blue paper. Here's an example of the Script CA watermark. And this is a slightly different color of the blue. It's brighter. It has a little bit more green in it. Um, it's not obvious until you hold the stamps next to one another, but there are some differences. But really, for Gibbons purposes, the ones that have the most listings are the yellow and green papers. There's almost no listings in Gibbons to differentiate the colored papers on the script CA watermark, even though, in my opinion, there are differences to be collected. And there are differences that are quite stark and every bit as interesting as on the early papers. So that's another field for study. Plate flaws, they're not very common on De La Rue issues in general. De La Rue had very high quality control procedures to ensure that the stamps met with specifications, but occasionally you do find printing flaws and voids and freaks and frame breaks and things of those nature. You should always put those aside when you find them because they're not common. The problem with Gibbons catalog is that they will not list a variety unless it can be proven constant. And the problem is, in order to prove a variety constant, you have to have full sheets of the stamps to find the variety in the sheets. And really, you need to have more than one sheet. And in most cases, most of the sheets of these stamps have long been broken up to supply dealers and new issue dealers especially. So even for a low value stamp like a 1 penny or a halfpenny, it's very rare to find a full pane of 60 stamps or even a very large block that you can actually plate. So for that reason, my belief is that very few of the existing plate varieties or flaws are listed in Gibbons because people simply can't prove them to be constant. So that's another aspect of this issue to look out for carefully. Postal history, very, very popular, very complicated, and fairly lucrative, I would say, because there was a lot of different rates that were emerging as various airmail services came online, and I think you could still find deals in cover boxes and junk boxes. I mean, it's harder now to get high value covers. A lot of the high value covers are philatelic. But you can get low value ones to good destinations, without breaking the bank. The other thing is specimens. So most of the values can be found with the Type 3 Samuel specimen overprint. Just trying to get this in focus here. So there's one on the shilling stamp. Now, those are listed in Gibbons at quite a low amount. I mean, if you look, most sets, if there's a set of 12 stamps, Gibbons will have it listed for, say, $225 to $325 for the set. They only list them in sets, which makes valuing individual stamps a little tricky. Generally speaking, my view on specimens is that the price of a specimen is about the same regardless of the face value. And the reason for that is that the number produced is equal usually across all the values in a set. Between 240 and about 400 of these were produced in each issue. And basically, one specimen would be produced for one member nation of the UPU to have as its sample of the valid stamps. So they would know which stamps were genuine and which ones were not. Um, so the number of specimens produced generally will depend on how many member nations the UPU had at the time the specimens were issued. Usually they will come from the earliest printings, although occasionally there will be subsequent printings made when new member nations joined. Um, although by the time the King George V Imperium Keyplates come out in 1913-14, most of the UPU's nations membership is already joined. So it's fairly stable. But, because they were issued to member nations and they were in sample books, a lot of the copies that you see will be without gum or will have disturbed gum because they had to be soaked out of the books that they were in a lot of instances. So Gibbons catalogs them as hinged, but in practice, a lot of specimens that you come across are going to have no gum. And I think that pretty much does it for today's video. You'll see in the auction this week a large coverage of Nigeria, which is my strongest country. Somewhat sparse in the other countries, but Nigeria will give you a very good idea of what can be done with this issue in terms of depth. The main book, the Holy Grail book on this issue and design, is Peter Fernbank's book on the Imperium Keyplates. And in his book, he actually has requisition numbers, plate numbers, sheet numbers, where he's gone back to the archives for De La Rue and actually tabulated the printings that were made. So that's an invaluable reference source to have if you're going to specialize in these. But a very attractive set. To me, they're kind of the admirals, if you will, of the British Commonwealth. With all the colors, there's just lots of eye appeal to them, even though the designs themselves are somewhat utilitarian. Anyway, that's good for now. Thank you very much for watching. Bye.